On September 8th, 1620, in a quiet corner of Venice, a 16-year-old girl named Elena Cassandra Tarabotti knelt on the stone floor of a convent while a nun cut off her hair. According to Tarabotti, this was not a choice. It was a sentence. Her father had decided she would enter the convent of Sant'Anna. She was the eldest of 7 daughters. She walked with a limp. And in the cold arithmetic of her family, that made her a bad marriage prospect and an expensive problem. If that sounds brutal, it was. But Elena's story was not some isolated act of cruelty. For many noble families across Catholic Europe, convents were not just houses of God. They were a solution, a respectable way to remove daughters, protect inheritance, and avoid the crushing cost of marriage. And once a girl was inside, getting back out was almost impossible. Not every nun was forced. Not every convent was miserable. But for many noble daughters, the convent solved a family problem before it served a spiritual calling. Because behind the language of devotion was a much colder truth. Daughters were expensive. In elite society, marriage was not mainly about love. It was about land, alliances, status, and money. A daughter could not simply be married off for free. She needed a dowry, and for noble families, that dowry could be enormous: cash, property, jewelry, sometimes even claims tied to land and income. 1 daughter was manageable, 2 was painful, 4 or 5 could become a financial threat, because every daughter meant another dowry, and every dowry meant wealth leaving the house. In a world where land was power, that was dangerous. Families were obsessed with keeping estates intact, titles secure, and bloodlines socially equal or higher. A strong marriage could help a family rise. A weak one could dilute status, fracture wealth, and advertise decline to every rival watching. So noble households made choices. Usually the son inherited the core of the family position. Maybe one daughter got the prestigious marriage. Maybe another got a smaller one. But the rest, especially younger daughters, daughters with disabilities, daughters whose matches fell through, daughters born after the family's finances worsened, could become a problem that needed to disappear without looking like a scandal. And that is where the convent came in. Because convents were cheaper, a girl entering a convent still usually required a payment, often called a convent dowry. But it was typically far smaller than the dowry needed to secure a suitable noble marriage. That meant a family could preserve far more of its wealth by sending a daughter into religious life than by marrying her off well. And once you see the economics, the whole system starts to look different. This was not just piety, it was strategy. A convent allowed a family to say all the right things. Their daughter was not rejected. She was devoted. She was not unwanted. She was answering a holy calling. The language was honorable. The reality could be anything but. In places like Venice, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Historians have argued that in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, aristocratic girls there were more likely to end up in convents than in marriage. Not because an entire generation suddenly became more spiritual, but because noble families refused to let daughters marry beneath their rank and could not afford to marry them all advantageously. So they sent the extra daughters to God. And even convents reflected the same class hierarchy outside their walls. Prestigious houses favoured elite families. Lower status households could find themselves shut out. The convent was supposed to stand apart from worldly ambition, but in practice it often reproduced it. Now, saving money was one thing. Making sure the solution stayed solved was another. Once a woman took solemn vows, especially after Catholic reforms tightened enclosure in the 16th century, leaving became extraordinarily difficult. In practice, for many women, it was functionally impossible. The convent was not a boarding school. It was not a temporary arrangement. It was meant to be for life. And life inside was built around obedience. A nun renounced marriage. She renounced personal property. She lived by a strict rule. Her time was scheduled around prayer, labor, silence, ritual, and supervision. Contact with the outside world was restricted. Visitors often had to speak through grates or screens. Movement was controlled. Privacy was limited. Freedom, in any modern sense, barely existed. For a woman who genuinely wanted that life, this structure could feel meaningful, even sacred. For a girl placed there by her family, it could feel like burial. That is the part people often miss. The suffering was not only physical, it was psychological. Imagine being told at 12 or 14 or 16 that your future had already been decided. That you would never marry, never choose your own home, never decide your own path. Not because God had called you, but because your family had done the math. And if you think wealthy convents were easier, only partly. Some elite convents were comfortable by the standards of the time. Noble nuns might have private rooms, music, libraries, servants, family connections, and influence inside powerful religious networks. A woman from the right background could still wield status from behind convent walls, but comfort is not the same as freedom. A rich convent could be a gilded cage. A poor convent could be a hard sell. The food, discipline, privacy, and daily labor might differ. The enclosure did not, and not every girl accepted it quietly. Records and accounts from the period describe nuns who resisted. Some refused parts of the ritual, some smuggled letters, some broke rules, some pursued forbidden relationships, some tried to escape. Some spent years protesting the fact that they had never truly wanted the life they had been forced into. Which brings us back to Elena Tarabotti. Because Tarabotti did something dangerous, she said the quiet part out loud. She spent her life inside Sant'Anna, but she turned that confinement into an attack on the entire system. She taught herself, wrote fiercely, and denounced what she called forced monarchization. In works like Paternal Tyranny and Convent Hell, she described convent life not as holy refuge, but as a prison built by fathers, protected by custom, and disguised as virtue. That is why her story matters so much. She lets us see the system from the inside. From the family's point of view, the arrangement was almost perfect. A daughter in a convent was no longer a dowry crisis. She was no longer a risky marriage negotiation. She was far less likely to destabilize inheritance plans, embarrass the household, or force the family into an expensive alliance. She had been removed from the board, and because religion wrapped the whole thing in dignity, the cruelty could hide in plain sight. A father was not abandoning his daughter, he was giving her to God. Society could call it sacrifice, the family could call it honor. Church authorities often accepted or enabled it in practice, and the girl herself, once enclosed, had almost no power. That was the genius of the system. It turned coercion into respectability. Even states occasionally admitted what was happening. Venetian legal language from the period acknowledged noble girls being shut away in convents amid tears and complaints. The authorities could see the suffering, they could hear the protest. But the machine kept working because it served too many interests at once. Family wealth, social order, elite reputation, religious authority. And that is the real story here. The convent was not only a religious institution. For many noble families, it was a social tool, a financial tool, a reputational tool, a way to lock a daughter out of inheritance politics while making the act look holy, a respectable prison. Tarabotti understood that better than anyone. She spent decades behind walls she said she never chose, writing against a world that found it easier to silence daughters than provide for them. Her family called it duty, the culture called it virtue, she called it tyranny. And for many girls sent into convents for reasons that had far more to do with dowries than devotion, she was right. Because once you strip away the language of piety, the question becomes brutally simple. What do you call a system that takes unwanted daughters, seals them behind walls, and tells them it is for their own good? In early modern Catholic Europe, noble families had an answer. They called it holiness.